Afternoon, everyone. So I feel like I'm the odd one out in the IAC quartet in that, yeah, I'm not talking about anywhere in the city centre, but as Sean said, I'm talking about a site that's out near St Margaret's. So the site is located there, and that's basically just the end of the runway at Dublin Airport. So that just gives you a rough idea of the location. So the site was listed as an RMP, and it was originally, or the correspondence in the RMP file says that the site was levelled in 1953. It had been a bit of a raised mound before that. So there was a test excavation carried out in 2005 by the archaeology company, and they determined the presence of archaeology there in terms of ditches. And one half of the site was able to be preserved in situ under a logistics warehouse that was built over part of it. So then they wanted to expand the logistics part and our park, and so in November 2017, the site was stripped, and Octra Archaeological Company did what we call a stage 2 assessment, in which they determined what was there. So if you'll indulge me for a few moments, I know we're at a medieval symposium, but I'm going to start talking about the Bronze Age. In that, one of the earliest feature we found on site was a single prehistoric crouched inhumation burial. It was in a partially stone-lined pit, but unusually the lower limbs and pelvis had been overlaid by a cremation deposit. So our osteoarchaeologist, Maeve Tobin, she identified the unburnt remains as that of a young adult male, and within the cremated bone, there was at least 2 contemporary individuals, a young adult, or a young child and an adult. So the amount of bone, the cremated bone, wasn't enough that we had 2 complete individuals, but was just a token representative there. So we also had 2 pots. There was one there by his head, and the other had been placed over his right foot. So it seems there's no other parallels or graves similar to this, other than possibly grave 3 at Old Town, a quarry in County Kildare, and it was excavated by Charles Mount. So he's of the opinion that you don't really usually get single kist burials or stuck pit burials by themselves, but that was the only Bronze Age activity we found on site. We did get a couple of stray pieces of prehistoric pottery within some of our enclosure ditches. So as you can see there, our radiocarbon date was early Bronze Age there. Mirren has done testing more recently in the field to the north of just this area around here, to the field to the north of our site, and has identified more ring ditches in that area. And I think aerial photography from the hot summer of 2018 also identified further ring ditches in the area. So it does seem to be part of a wider complex. So I'll skip forward a couple of thousand years now. Oh, sorry, yeah, there's the blocks. The pots were block lifted by Susanna Kelly, and Elaine Lynch identified that they are rib bowls. So around 1980 to 1920 BC. So now I'll skip forward a couple of thousand years. And so we further burial activity on site. When Octra did their stage 2 analysis, they excavated 9 inhumation burials. All were east-west oriented. And so we went on site. We found another grave, or a few further burials on site. Most of the 3 most interesting ones were log burials, in that there was timber lining of the grave. There's a bit of a timber there on that. And so our log burials seem to indicate that they were transported there from elsewhere, like the log burials are usually indicate transporting them. Maeve and Linda Lynch identified 22 individuals in our cemetery, and that they seem to be all in relatively good health, and this demographic is pretty much standard in terms of number of young individuals, adults and adolescents, all seems to be fairly standard. And so we think it was just an extended familial cemetery. Yeah, there's more of our log burials there. There's one with the timber. You can see the timber just on top of the chest, and after we removed it, you can see log timber there underneath it. So they generally date to the 5th centuries, our bone the bone from our graves wasn't in good enough condition to get a radiocarbon date from it, but we were able to date some of the older, and it seems to be earlier in that it could be to the late 4th century. So whether the tree was felled in the 4th century and used in the 5th century for the log burial, or whether it extends the date range back to the 4th century, we can't really be certain for that. So then this is just a quick plan of the site. So this is where most of our graves were centered. There was a few little sporadic ones out here, here, and here. And when the testing was done in 2005, they identified burials in the northeast of the enclosure, which is now under the car park of the logistics warehouse. So it seems that there were 2 phases of activity in the graveyard. Like there were some from, as I was saying, some from the 5th century and some from the 7th to 8th century as well. But it seems we had the ditch, or the cemetery was enclosed by a ditch. This was an earlier ditch, and then at a later stage, when it had been infilled, it was completely recut, and it seemed to stay faithful to or run parallel to the original ditch, apart from just at the north side where it deviated slightly and went onto the inside. But there's just some of the couple of photos of it. So it enclosed an area around 50 meters, and we got a date from the basal fill of around AD 420 to 555. Some of our finds included a ballast head ring pin, which can range from the 2nd to the mid 12th century, and we got bone pin, one of the bone pins from modified pig rib, and they're common on early medieval and medieval sites. We also had then 3 radial ditches, one in the north, one in the northwest, and one in the southwest, which seemed to be the formation of a field system. So again, they seem to date to 576 or 655 AD. As I mentioned, the recut generally respects the original ditch and seems to be a tie-in with some of the later burials on site in around 680 to 880. And there was a huge amount of animal bone in it, including a number of cattle skulls. So unfortunately, we haven't got our faunal report back yet, so I can't say too much about it, any of the bone. But Ruth Garden is doing it for us, and she recently asked me if I'd be help her with a research project she's doing on Viking dogs. So I presume we have some dogs in amongst our skeletal remains, but the most obvious were the cow skulls. So again, we got the usual medieval and late medieval finds from our ditch in terms of household pins that are known from those sort of contexts. So then after that, it seems as though there was a complete change of use inside, in that there was another large enclosure formed. This was a huge ditch. It was around 6 meters wide and up to 2.8 meters deep. It was fairly challenging to excavate. And then the second parallel ditch coming around outside it, which was relatively sterile. So they truncated our radial ditches, and as you can see down here in the south, it truncated our earlier ditches as well. So yeah, the finds from our outer ditch included an iron blade and a stone object, which our find specialist Scully thinks may have been a lamp. So there's just a couple of photos to show our large ditch. There's the scale of it. It was up on the north side of the site. It was brought down onto bedrock. It probably would have been deeper only for that. So we did get 33 shards of medieval pottery. Most of it was all Dublin ware, Dublin courseware, and Dublin type cooking ware. We did get a little bit of Chester type ware from England, but Siobhan was saying most of our medieval pottery was Irish. There's only a few shards that came from England. We did also got a spindle whirl and an iron blade, a copper alloy stick pin that roughly date to the 11th to 13th century. So from here on in, we seem to have problems with our radiocarbon dates, in that they didn't meet my expectations. A lot of them seem to be earlier than we were expecting. Like I suppose you can see the one we got from the basal fill of the ditch was around 890 or to 1020. And so there were further burials in the ditch then as well. In this one was in the southwest quadrant of the ditch. It dates to the 1226 or 1276 and was an older child. It's maybe around 9 years of age, Maeve thought. So it seems to have been based or buried in a hasty manner, and it was semi-prone, so lying on its side, more or less face down, and its arms were extended. And it was around 1.1 meters below the present ground level out there. I should say that we found evidence of the leveling from 1953 in that the top meter of that enclosure ditch was full of modern rubbish like sheets of galvanized and oil drums and that sort of thing. So in this one, Maeve did recognize there were mild lesions in the orbits of the eyes that may represent a period of stress at the time of death. Then around 14 meters further south than that, at a depth of around 165, we found a disarticulated skull, an adult, probably a female. So there's a possibility it came from a grave within the enclosure, but we didn't find any burials that were missing a skull. Well, we found one, but it was a male, and I'll talk about that later on, just in a few minutes. Anyway, then on the north side of the ditch, we found this guy. He was a lot older, an older man. He was buried in a more respectful manner, but it still had a hurried feel to it, in that he was in his extended supine position with the arms across, but there was a slight flex in his knees, as though they didn't bother leveling it off. And so he was higher up in the ditch as well, in that he was only around 1.10 meters below the ground surface. Maeve identified he had well-healed fractures of 2 left anterior ribs and a right arm. The fractures were well-healed, so that they were at least several months before his death. She's found familiar lesions on the skull, which can be due to physiological stress, like illness or malnutrition. So whether that was related to his defensive injuries, the parry fractures as they can be called, it's hard to tell. There were no perimortem injuries identified, but he may have had some sort of soft tissue injuries that led to his death. It's hard to tell. They don't leave any trace in the osteological record. So now my next slide is probably the main reason I'm here. It's some of the shiny stuff we got from our ditch. Again, this causes problems in it. We found 30 of these coins, Hiberno Norse coins. I don't have many photographs of them. This conference probably comes a little around a week too early, because I got forms from the National Museum to fill in for use, for permission to use photos, but I only got to send it back yesterday morning. So I'll have lovely high quality, high resolution photos of some of our nice coins to show you next week. So yeah, there are 30 Hiberno Norse coins. Michael Kenny in National Museum just sent me a preliminary report recently. And so we've no phase 1 or phase 2 coins. We've some phase 3, which date to 1035 or 1065, but most are phase 5. So from around 1065 to 1095. So it seems to post-date some of the Dublin hoards, like the 2 from Castle Street and Werburgh Street, were much later and much smaller than them. So Michael has said it's most similar to the Clonmacnoise hoard, which was similar in size to ours. Well, it was in that they had 30 coins as well. And both the Clonmacnoise hoard and ours have examples of the Angus Day coin, and also a square-facing bust or coin that has a square-facing bust on the obverse side and a long cross on the reverse. So Michael estimated date of deposition to the late 10th century or 11th century, 1095 or so. The only problem with that was this was at a depth of 1.1 meters in our ditch, and we found some of our Dublin courseware from the 12th to 14th century at lower levels in the ditch. So yeah, we'll have a lot of that sort of conflict in our dates from now on. So then on the south side of the ditch, just in the southeast corner of our part of the site, we found this stone platform. It was at a depth of just over 1 meter. You can see there's the platform. There's the present ground level up there. This was a bit of a test trench, like possibly from 2005 or from the stripping in 2017. But you can, this is the edge of our large ditch coming through here, and you can see there's curbing on the stone there along the edge. So the function of it is unclear. It's too deep down to be any sort of entrance causeway or anything like that. There's not a huge amount of information to say it was a working platform or anything like that. We did get a flint concave scraper from it and more of our Dublin type courseware body sherds, so 12th to 13th century, and then a possible early medieval strike-a-light from it. So there was charcoal recovered. There was a foundation layer under our stones, and we got a charcoal from it, but it gave back a foundation or a date of 420 to 555. So once again, doesn't really tie in with what we were expecting or some of our finds there as well. So then I'll move on to some of the interior of our enclosure. And so we had 5 different structures here. We call that structure 1 there. This is structure 2 there, and structure 3 there, and structure 4 there. And that's just remnants of structure 5. So this, I'll just briefly skip to structure 2 and say that this shows that it doesn't seem to tie in with the earlier phases of activity in the burial, in that this is one of our burials there, but it was decapitated by our structure 2. That was an adult male, so it's obviously not the same skull as the female skull we found in our ditch. So again, structure 1 here, we got some nice medieval finds from it, an iron pin, shank, an iron pin, a stone object, and that looks like a spindle word, but it's not complete, it's not finished, so a blank for it. So again, our radiocarbon date from charcoal there didn't match in with our finds in that it gave us an Iron Age date. So it shows there's Iron Age activity on site, but we didn't really find anything definitive of Iron Age. Just charcoal must have been washed in again. So I suppose now this highlights the recommendation that when you're going for charcoal dates, you try and use charcoal from a feature that shows burning in situ. And this is the exact reason why, in that you don't want to get washed in charcoal that can skew your dates. So as I mentioned, this is structure 2 here, and that truncated our skeleton until we got 6 sherds of our medieval pottery, our Dublin courseware from it as well. So again, 12th to 13th century. Structure 4 here is just long, 15.8 meters long. And I assume it was some sort of division dividing the site into different type of areas. Like most of the features we found were suggesting industrial type function for the site. This was our little structure 3 there as well. I'd say if you extended it on this way, it might match in with structure 2. And so, yeah, from structure 4 here, we've got another 24 sherds of medieval pottery, the same Dublin courseware, Dublin ware, and Dublin type cooking ware. Our structure 5 here was truncated by this as a later feature, which I'll get onto later on. And it was one of the 2 features that we got English pottery, medieval pottery from. We got some Southeast Wiltshire ware from it. So on the interior, we also got a number of pits and post holes, just random sort of features, just what you'd expect to get in your usual early medieval enclosures. But so we did get some nice larger pits. There's one here in the southwest and one here in the southeast that were, I suppose, a little bit more unusual or noteworthy in that, again, this one had a large amount of charcoal and some metallurgical residue at the base. But then after it had been refilled or infilled, it was reused as a kiln, and we got charred oats and wheat from it. So it gave us a radiocarbon date for early medieval 641 to 775. So that could tie in with some of the activity from our earlier burials, but I was expecting it to be later, tie in with the dates for the structures. And then we had a pit in the southeast of it. It was this one here. And again, there was a large quantity of charcoal at the base. And then when it had been half backfilled, there was a layer of wood lining on it. And it was alder. And again, we got a large quantity of ash and wood fragments over the lining. And then amongst that was some fuel ash slag and a large quantity of animal bone. Included in the fuel ash slag was little bits of calcified bone and burnt bone. And Dr. T.P. Young, who analyzed our slag, suggested that it was probably most likely domestic waste burning and stuff, and so may have just been dumped in the pit. He did say there was a possibility it was from a cremation burial, but he was most likely it came from just domestic waste burial. So we did get, again, 2 medieval bone pins made from modified pig fibulae, a stone hone, and 2 medieval blades from it. And then again, we got a radiocarbon date that was a little bit earlier than anticipated in 558 to 646. And so then this pit down here was in the south of the site. And again, large quantity of charcoal and ash deposits in it. You might be able to see the layer of charcoal and ash just along there, and also a huge quantity of animal bone. All three of these pits were very prone to filling with groundwater. It was very hard to keep them dry and get them excavated. So this one had some lovely finds in it, in 3 bone pins, a stone hone, and we had an iron knife that had an antler handle as well. And similar then, this is our structure 4 just there, and this pit was just to the southwest of it. Again, large quantity of charcoal and animal bone, a household pin, iron nail, and a flint convex end scraper were recovered from it. I don't have photos of it, but into one of the pits in the north of the site, just inside the large enclosure ditch, we believe it was a charcoal production pit. And interestingly, it was one of only 2 features on the site that we got any sort of oak charcoal from. The other one was the early Bronze Age burial. The only other charcoal we got was generally ash, alder, elm, and willow, which willow generally indicates there was a wetland area near the site. And as we excavated the site in the depths of winter, I can confirm there was plenty of groundwater on the site. Yeah, so then I'll move on to just later activity on the well, or the feature that struck truncated our structure 5 was a large stone bit well. It seemed to be a lot later in date than I was expecting, but then just in around here, we got a large sherd of Dublin type cooking ware. So it seems to be again 12th to 14th century. We were able to excavate it down to a depth of 1.8 meters, and probing through the base seemed to indicate that it was going maybe another 1.5 meters deep before we met any resistance. So it just wasn't safe to dig any deeper, so we left it at that. So now I will just, Siobhan Scully did our summary of our small finds. And so in addition to the 2 Bronze Age pots, we had 82 sherds of pottery, but she was able to refit a few of them. So we ended up with 74, and 89% of those were medieval. And the vast majority of, as I said, were locally produced, but only a small amount from England, only from 2 features. The post-medieval pottery that we got was the exact opposite, in that most of it was English, and there were only a few sherds of domestically made post-medieval pottery. But again, all our post-medieval pottery was from just cleaning back to the surface. We couldn't come back or tie them to any of the features. So our lithic analysis, we had 29 lithics. They were all flint. There were 4 cores, 5 scrapers, 19 pieces of debitage, and 1 gun flint. The only piece that could be anyway dated with a degree of certainty was the gun flint, which was 17th or 18th century. But again, it came from just our clean back of the site. Then amongst our stone artifacts, of which there were 6, we had 2 home stones, a spindle whorl from the 12th to 13th century. We had 1 blank for a possible spindle whorl, a rubbing stone, and then, as I said, the stone object that Siobhan thinks was a lamp. And so then our metal artifacts, there were 40 of them. There were iron blades, ring pins, a stick pin, household pins, striker lights, nails, and miscellaneous objects. We also, from the clean back, got 2 additional coins, but they were just very denuded and worn. We couldn't really say anything much about them. Then we also had 7 bone pins, which were pretty much all made of the modified pig fibulae. And we also, one of the pits had 1 piece of antler, which was just working waste. So I'll just go through. There's just a few photos. There's the knife that has the antler handle that came from our large pit, with the all the ash and charcoal. This is the piece of pottery that came from our well, and this is our spindle whorl. And these just are iron blades and selection of our knives and 1 of our stick pins there. So there's our little balance for the scales, and one of our striker lights there then as well. And again, just our iron knives and bone pins, just the artifacts. So that's just a general post-ex view of the site. One thing, I suppose, just there did seem to be a little bit of a mound created there for the cluster of burials that we had there. And it seems to have been just a large pit dug and a preparation area made for our burials to be inserted into that then as well. This is the location of where our stone platform was. And yeah, there are just our various large pits around it there. So I think I may have made up a bit more time now for these questions in that I kind of went through rather quickly, I believe. So yeah, just a summary. It was a multi-phase site, like starting from the early Bronze Age burial, whether there was any influence, whether the Bronze Age burial had any influence on the siting of the early medieval burials and the enclosure, we don't know. It was hard to tell. Like the leveling of the site in the 1950s just means that we don't know if there was any sort of bank or any feature that would have attracted them, or whether it was just coincidental and the same factors that brought the Bronze Age people there brought the early medieval people there. We don't know. So yeah, the large enclosure signifies the huge change of use and that it didn't respect any of the earlier burials, as shown by the decapitation of the one. And then we had our deviant burials in the ditch. Our coin hoard, it just shows some of our difficulties with dating, in that we have earlier features overlying, or earlier dating artifacts overlying later dating artifacts, and that are on the interior. It seems to be mostly industrial activity, including metalworking, and then we have our later well on site. So I think I went a little bit too fast there, but thanks very much for listening anyway.